Black Nanny noticed red marks on the millionaire's daughter. What she did left him silent. The marble floors of the Whitmore mansion gleam under crystal chandeliers, each surface reflecting wealth that spans generations. Grace Washington moves through these halls with quiet dignity, her dark hands gentle against the pristine white banister as she climbs towards 7-year-old Emma's room. 20 years of caring for other people's children has taught her to see what others miss, to hear the silence between words, to recognize the shadows that money cannot chase away. Today, something is different about Emma. A flinch when touched, eyes that dart away too quickly, red marks on pale skin that tell stories no child should carry. In a house where appearances matter more than truth, Grace faces an impossible choice between her job and her conscience, between silence and a reckoning that could destroy everything. Grace's morning routine begins before dawn, her footsteps echoing softly through corridors lined with portraits of Whitmore ancestors, generations of pale faces watching from gilded frames with eyes that seem to judge her presence in their sacred space. She prepares Emma's breakfast with the same care she once gave her own daughter, now grown and working as a teacher 3 states away. The irony isn't lost on her. She raised other people's children while missing precious moments with her own, trading her maternal instincts for a paycheck that barely covered her own family's needs. This morning feels different, weighted with the kind of tension that makes experienced caregivers trust their instincts even when logic argues otherwise. Emma appears at the kitchen doorway like a ghost, her usually bright demeanor replaced by something Grace recognizes from her years working in homes where secrets live behind locked doors. The child's movements are careful, calculated to avoid drawing attention to herself, behavior that sets alarm bells ringing in Grace's experienced mind. "Good morning, sweetheart," Grace says softly, her voice carrying the warmth that has comforted dozens of children over the years. Emma's response is barely a whisper, her small frame seeming to fold in on itself as she approaches the breakfast table. The change from yesterday's chattering excitement to today's fearful silence creates a knot of worry in Grace's stomach. As Grace helps Emma with her school uniform, she notices the angry red welts across the child's shoulders, marks too precise to be accidental, too fresh to be old injuries. Her hands still involuntarily, decades of childcare experience warring with the careful boundaries she's learned to maintain in wealthy households. Emma flinches at the touch, her blue eyes filling with tears she's clearly been taught not to shed. "Honey, what happened to your back?" Grace asks gently, but Emma's rehearsed response comes too quickly. "I fell down the stairs yesterday. Daddy says I'm clumsy." The lie sits heavy between them, its weight familiar to Grace from other homes. Other children who learn to protect their abusers even at the cost of their own safety. The breakfast routine continues with forced normalcy, but Grace's trained eye catalogs every detail. The way Emma holds her fork to avoid pressure on her fingers, the careful way she sits to protect her back, the practiced smile that doesn't reach her eyes. These are adaptations Grace has seen before, survival mechanisms children develop when home becomes a battlefield. Richard Whitmore's footsteps echoed down the marble staircase, his presence filling the kitchen with an authority that makes even the air feel thinner. He's everything society expects from a successful man: tall, confident, expensively dressed. But Grace sees what his polished exterior is designed to hide, the controlled rage simmering just beneath the surface of his perfect smile. "Emma, darling, eat your breakfast properly," Richard commands, his tone carrying the kind of controlled violence that makes children learn to disappear. Grace watches the interaction with growing certainty, recognizing the subtle terrorism that happens in homes where image matters more than innocence. Emma's shoulders tense at her father's voice, her small hands gripping her fork with white knuckles as she forces herself to eat despite having no appetite. Grace's own hands clench involuntarily, her maternal instincts screaming against the injustice unfolding before her. She's seen this pattern too many times. Wealthy men who view their families as possessions to be controlled, children who learn to perform happiness while dying inside. The silence stretches like a rubber band about to snap, and Grace realizes she's reached the moment where staying quiet becomes complicity in whatever darkness has taken root in this gilded cage. Richard's departure for work should bring relief, but instead it amplifies the tension that permeates every corner of the mansion. Grace watches from the kitchen window as his black BMW disappears through the iron gates, leaving behind a silence that feels more threatening than peaceful. Emma remains at the breakfast table, her small frame trembling with exhaustion that comes from hypervigilance, the constant state of alertness that children develop when they never know what might trigger violence. Grace has worked in enough troubled homes to recognize the signs, but this situation carries additional complexity that makes her stomach churn with anxiety and moral uncertainty. The morning light streaming through expensive windows illuminates dust motes that dance like secrets in the air, each particle a reminder of how much remains hidden in plain sight. Grace begins her cleaning routine, but her attention stays focused on Emma, who sits motionless at the table like a statue carved from fear and resignation. "Would you like to help me with the flowers today?" Grace offers, hoping to draw the child into activities that might create safe spaces for conversation. Emma's head shakes almost imperceptibly, her voice barely audible. "Daddy doesn't like me touching his roses. He says I ruin everything I touch." The casual cruelty embedded in those words creates a flash of rage in Grace's chest that she struggles to contain. As they move through the morning routine, Grace notices details that yesterday seemed insignificant, but now feel like evidence in a case she's afraid to fully acknowledge. The way Emma automatically steps aside when adults approach, making herself smaller and less noticeable. The practiced apologetic tone she uses for everything, even asking for water or permission to use the bathroom. The careful way she arranges her toys, everything perfectly aligned as if disorder might trigger punishment too terrible to risk. These behaviors speak of systematic psychological terrorism designed to break a child's spirit, to reshape her into something compliant and invisible. The house phone rings, its shrill tone cutting through the oppressive quiet like a knife. Grace answers with her professional voice, but the caller sends ice through her veins. It's Emma's school, asking why she wasn't in attendance yesterday. Grace's eyes find Emma, who has gone completely still, her face drained of what little color it held. She was feeling unwell. Grace lies automatically, the words tasting like poison in her mouth. After hanging up, she turns to find Emma staring at her with eyes that hold too much knowledge for someone so young. "Thank you," the child whispers, and Grace realizes she's just become complicit in whatever system of abuse keeps this family's secrets locked behind mansion walls. The weight of that complicity sits like lead in Grace's chest as she goes through the motions of household management. She's worked for difficult families before, witnessed the casual cruelties that wealth often enables, but this feels different, sharper, more deliberately malicious. Emma follows her through the house like a shadow, seeking the safety of adult presence while maintaining the careful distance that trauma teaches. Grace finds herself studying the child's movements, cataloging injuries that careful clothing almost hides, recognizing the signs of systematic abuse disguised as parental discipline. The red marks on Emma's shoulders are just what's visible. Grace's experience tells her there's much more hidden beneath expensive clothes and practiced lies. As lunchtime approaches, Grace makes a decision that will change everything. She kneels down to Emma's level, her dark hands gentle on the child's pale cheeks, her voice carrying the authority of someone who has spent decades protecting children. "Emma, sweetheart, I need you to know something very important. What's happening to you? It's not your fault. And it's not okay. No matter what anyone tells you, children should never be hurt by the people who are supposed to love them. Emma's eyes widen with shock and something that might be hope, her small voice breaking as she whispers. But Daddy says it's because I'm bad. He says if I was a better daughter, he wouldn't have to. Grace's heart shatters completely, but her resolve hardens like steel, understanding that this moment will define not just Emma's future, but her own moral legacy. The afternoon sun slants through tall windows, casting long shadows that seem to point toward an inevitable confrontation Grace can no longer avoid. She sits with Emma in the child's pristine bedroom, surrounded by expensive toys that have clearly been arranged for display rather than play. Each perfect doll, each untouched book, each precisely placed stuffed animal tells the story of a childhood lived under the weight of impossible expectations and constant threat. Grace's hands shake slightly as she pulls out her phone, knowing that the call she's about to make will end her employment and possibly her career, but also knowing that some lines cannot be uncrossed once you've seen them clearly. Emma, I'm going to call some people who help children who are being hurt, Grace says, her voice steady despite the storm raging in her chest. They'll want to talk to you, and I'll be right there with you the whole time, okay? Emma's response is pure terror. Her small body begins to tremble violently, and she grabs Grace's arm with desperate strength. No, please. Daddy will be so angry. He'll say I'm lying, that I'm trying to get attention. No one will believe me anyway. He's too important. They never believe kids like me. The practiced hopelessness in Emma's voice reveals how thoroughly her spirit has been broken, how completely she's been taught that her pain doesn't matter compared to her father's reputation. Grace pulls Emma close, feeling the child's rapid heartbeat against her chest like a bird trapped in a cage. Baby girl, listen to me. I've been taking care of children for 20 years, and I've never seen a child who was lying about being hurt. Adults who hurt children always tell them that no one will believe them, that it's their fault, that they deserve it. But none of that is true. Her words seem to crack something open in Emma's carefully constructed defenses, and the child begins to sob with the kind of raw grief that comes from years of suppressed terror. Grace holds her tighter, her own tears falling freely as she whispers promises she prays she can keep about safety and justice and the possibility of a life without fear. The phone call to Child Protective Services feels surreal, like stepping through a doorway into a parallel universe where wealthy men can be held accountable for their crimes. Grace speaks quietly, clearly, providing details with the precision of someone who understands that every word matters, that the difference between justice and continued abuse often comes down to the credibility of witnesses willing to speak truth to power. The social worker on the other end of the line listens with professional calm, asking questions that reveal this isn't the first such call she's received today. We'll need to interview the child immediately, she says. Can you keep her safe until we arrive? Grace looks at Emma, still trembling in her arms, and makes a promise that will change both their lives forever. Yes, whatever it takes. The waiting is the hardest part. Grace finds herself pacing through rooms that yesterday felt familiar, but now seem like crime scenes, each perfect surface hiding evidence of systematic cruelty. She thinks about her own daughter, safe in her teaching job thanks to sacrifices Grace made working in homes like this one. The irony cuts deep. She spent decades enabling wealthy families, maintaining their secrets, protecting their reputations while children suffered in designer bedrooms and marble bathrooms. Today, she chooses differently. Today, she chooses Emma over her employment, truth over comfort, justice over the silence that keeps broken systems functioning. The decision feels both terrifying and inevitable, like stepping off a cliff while trusting that sometimes falling is the only way to fly. When the doorbell rings, Emma's whole body goes rigid with fear. Grace takes her hand, squeezing gently as they walk toward the front door together. Remember what I told you? Grace whispers. You're brave, you're loved, and what happened to you is not your fault." Emma nods, her small chin lifting with determination that shouldn't be necessary for someone her age, but inspires Grace with its quiet strength. As they open the door to let in the social workers who will finally listen to Emma's truth, Grace realizes that this moment represents more than just one child's rescue. It's the beginning of a reckoning that will force everyone involved to confront the systems that allow wealth to buy silence and power to hide predators. The mansion's perfect facade is about to crumble, and Grace finds herself hoping the destruction will be thorough enough to rebuild something better from the ruins. Richard Whitmore returns home to find police cars lining his circular driveway, their red and blue lights painting his perfect white columns in colors that announce the end of his carefully constructed world. Grace stands on the front steps beside Detective Maria Rodriguez, her spine straight, and her chin lifted with the dignity of someone who has finally chosen justice over job security. Behind them, Emma sits in a child advocate's car, wrapped in a blanket that represents the first real safety she's known in years. Richard's face cycles through confusion, rage, and calculation as he realizes that his empire of silence has been breached by the one person he never considered a threat, the black woman he paid to be invisible while she witnessed his crimes. What is the meaning of this? Richard demands, his voice carrying the imperial authority of someone accustomed to controlling every narrative. Detective Rodriguez steps forward, her badge gleaming in the afternoon sun as she reads him his rights with the methodical precision of someone who has seen too many powerful men believe themselves above the law. Grace watches as Richard's carefully maintained facade begins to crack, revealing the fury that Emma has lived with every day. "You have the right to remain silent," Rodriguez continues. But Richard's explosion of rage drowns out her words as he focuses his venom on Grace with the pure hatred of someone whose victim has finally found a voice. "This is ridiculous. You're going to believe the word of a domestic worker over mine? I'm a pillar of this community. I've donated millions to charity." Richard's protests reveal everything wrong with a system that measures morality by bank account balances rather than treatment of the vulnerable. Grace doesn't flinch under his verbal assault, her years of experience with entitled employers having prepared her for exactly this moment. She speaks quietly to Detective Rodriguez. He's going to say Emma is lying, that she's troubled, that I'm trying to extort money from him. They always do. But I have photographs of her injuries, and I've documented every conversation we've had about what he calls discipline. That little girl has been living in terror for years. The assembled neighbors and media begin to gather, drawn by the spectacle of wealth being held accountable in a neighborhood where scandal usually gets buried under layers of money and influence. Grace sees familiar faces among the crowd. Other domestic workers, landscapers, delivery drivers, the invisible army of people who keep wealthy neighborhoods running while remaining unseen and unheard. Their expressions range from shock to something that looks almost like vindication, as if they've been waiting for someone to finally speak the truths that privilege works so hard to silence. Mrs. Henderson from next door clutches her pearls, her face a mask of disbelief that seems more concerned with property values than child abuse. As Richard is led away in handcuffs, his final words to Grace carry the kind of vicious racism that reveals what he's always thought of her beneath his polite employer facade. "You people always think you can destroy successful white families. This is exactly why we shouldn't trust you around our children." The ugliness of his true beliefs spills out like poison, confirming what Grace has always known, that her humanity was never recognized in this house, that she was merely a tool to be used and discarded when convenient. But his words have the opposite effect he intended. Instead of intimidating her, they steel her resolve and validate every choice she's made today. The crowd murmurs with uncomfortable recognition of sentiments many have heard before but rarely seen exposed so publicly. Detective Rodriguez walks Grace to her car, her expression mixing professional respect with personal admiration. You know he's going to fight this with everything he has, she warns. Expensive lawyers, character assassination, attempts to discredit your testimony. Are you prepared for that? Grace looks back at the mansion where she spent 2 years watching a child's spirit slowly die, then toward the car where Emma sits surrounded by advocates who will finally listen to her truth. Detective, I've been fighting systems designed to silence me my entire life. This is just another battlefield, and this time I have something more powerful than his money. I have the truth, and I have a little girl who deserves better. Let him bring his lawyers. We'll see how well wealth stands up against righteousness when the whole world is watching. The story explodes across social media within hours. Hashtags trending as the internet grapples with another case of wealth trying to hide systematic abuse. Grace finds herself at the center of a storm that reaches far beyond Emma's individual tragedy, her courage inspiring other domestic workers to share their own stories of witnessing abuse in wealthy homes while being powerless to act. The responses reveal a pattern so widespread it can no longer be ignored. Children suffering behind gates and hedges while the very people paid to care for them are trapped between financial necessity and moral obligation. Grace's phone buzzes constantly with messages from advocates, journalists, and other caregivers who see their own struggles reflected in her decision to choose justice over security. Emma's brave testimony to social workers and child psychologists becomes the foundation for charges that could put Richard away for decades. The child's careful documentation of abuse, dates, times, specific incidents, reveals an intelligence and resilience that humbles everyone involved in her case. Child advocate Sarah Chun works with Emma daily, helping her process trauma while building the emotional vocabulary needed to testify in court. She's remarkable, Chun tells Grace during one of their meetings. Most children her age can't articulate their experiences with such clarity. But she's been surviving by understanding her abuser's patterns, memorizing his triggers, learning to predict his moods. It's brilliant and heartbreaking at the same time. The legal battle that follows becomes a case study in how wealth attempts to manipulate justice. Richard's high-powered legal team launches a systematic attack on Grace's character, hiring private investigators to dig through her past, questioning her motives, suggesting financial desperation made her fabricate evidence. They paint her as an opportunistic employee seeking revenge for an employment dispute, conveniently ignoring the medical evidence of Emma's injuries and the detailed records Grace maintained. But their strategy backfires when other former employees come forward with similar stories, creating a pattern of abuse that spans years and multiple victims. The narrative shifts from isolated incident to systematic predation enabled by wealth and power. Grace's own family faces the collateral damage of her decision to speak truth to power. Her daughter calls, worried about online harassment and death threats that have started targeting Grace's relatives. "Mom, maybe you should just let the system handle this quietly," she suggests, fear evident in her voice. But Grace refuses to be intimidated into silence, understanding that backing down now would doom Emma and any future children who might cross Richard's path. "Baby, your mama didn't raise you to run from what's right just because it's hard," Grace responds. "This little girl needs to know that someone will fight for her, even when it costs everything. That's what love looks like when the chips are down." The mansion where Grace once worked becomes a crime scene, its perfect surfaces dusted for evidence, its hidden cameras revealing the systematic documentation of abuse that Richard used to control Emma through fear. The investigators find journals where Emma recorded her father's violence with the precision of someone trying to understand patterns that made no sense to a child's mind. Her writings break hearts throughout the legal system. Pages of apologies for being bad, promises to be better so daddy won't be angry, and detailed accounts of abuse disguised as discipline. These documents become the smoking gun that no amount of wealth or legal maneuvering can explain away. As the case moves toward trial, Grace finds herself transformed from invisible domestic worker to reluctant public figure, her story becoming a catalyst for larger conversations about domestic violence, child abuse, and the systems that protect wealthy predators. She speaks at conferences about the unique position domestic workers hold as witnesses to private family dynamics, advocating for legal protections that would allow them to report abuse without fear of deportation or unemployment. Her courage creates ripple effects she never anticipated, inspiring legislative changes that could protect future children and the workers who care for them. The personal has become political, and Grace discovers that sometimes the most powerful form of resistance is simply refusing to look away when powerful people commit unspeakable acts. 2 years later, Grace stands in a courthouse wearing her finest dress, not the uniform of service, but the armor of an advocate who has learned to own her power. Emma, now 9 and glowing with the confidence of a child who knows she is believed and protected, holds Grace's hand as they wait for the verdict that will determine Richard's fate. The little girl who once flinched at shadows now speaks with clear voice about her experiences, her testimony having moved hardened judges to tears and inspired legislation protecting domestic workers who report abuse. The transformation in both of them tells the story of what becomes possible when truth finally finds its voice and justice has the courage to listen. The courtroom fills with supporters, other domestic workers, child advocates, families who have faced similar struggles, and strangers whose hearts were touched by Emma's courage and Grace's sacrifice. Richard sits at the defendant's table, his expensive suit unable to hide the defeat that has settled into his shoulders like a permanent stoop. His wealth bought him legal delays and character assassinations, but it could not purchase innocence or erase the evidence of his systematic cruelty. The jury's faces reveal the impact of Emma's testimony, the power of Grace's meticulous documentation, and the weight of choosing justice over protecting privilege. When the verdict comes, guilty on all counts, the courtroom erupts in tears and applause. Emma squeezes Grace's hand tighter, her young face glowing with something Grace recognizes as the beginning of healing. "You kept your promise," Emma whispers. "You said someone would believe me, and they did." Grace nods, her own tears flowing freely as she realizes that this moment represents more than individual justice. It's proof that systems can change when ordinary people find extraordinary courage to stand up for what's right, regardless of the personal cost. The aftermath brings opportunities Grace never imagined possible. Publishers want her story, advocacy organizations offer speaking engagements, and legislative committees seek her expertise on protecting domestic workers and the children they serve. But more important than fame or financial security is the network of relationships she's built. Other caregivers who now have legal protections when reporting abuse, children who will be believed when they find courage to speak, and a system slightly more willing to hold wealthy predators accountable for their crimes. Her individual act of courage has become a movement that will protect countless others. Emma thrives in her new environment, living with foster parents who understand trauma while attending therapy sessions that help her process years of systematic abuse. Grace visits regularly, their bond deepened by shared struggle and mutual rescue. "Miss Grace," Emma says during one visit, "when I grow up, I want to help other kids like me. I want to be someone who listens and believes and fights for them." Grace smiles, recognizing that Emma's trauma is transforming into purpose, her survival becoming strength that will lift others out of darkness. The cycle of abuse has been broken, replaced by a legacy of protection and advocacy. As they walk through the park together, Grace reflects on the journey that brought them to this moment of peace and possibility. She thinks about the domestic workers still laboring in silence, witnessing abuse they feel powerless to report. She remembers her own years of looking away, choosing security over justice, and feels grateful for the moment when Emma's pain finally made silence impossible. "You know what I learned?" Grace tells Emma as they sit on a bench watching other children play freely. Sometimes love means risking everything to protect someone who can't protect themselves. That's what you taught me, sweetheart. You made me brave enough to do what was right, even when it was hard. If this story moved you, maybe there's a child in your world who needs someone to believe them, someone to see past polite surfaces to painful truths. If it is, be their grace.